everyone. This is the Freelancers Summit 2023, and this is one of the first, discussions that we have. I'm Tongai Choto, co-founder of AfriBlocks. Thank you so much for joining us, and I'm here with amazing colleagues. And the topic that we have here is, one that I know, everyone is looking forward to, around how do we grow more investments in African startup ecosystem. And the interesting thing though about the African startup ecosystem is it has actually been growing. And I was looking at the stats from the Big Deal, which is one of my go-to for how the performance has been going. And right now we just finished Q1, and globally it's minus 61% investment in VCs globally. But the interesting thing though is Africa is actually the one that is slowed down the lowest, with only minus 29% compared to all the other regions in the world. So you can say in some way that Africa is performing better than all the regions in terms of investment. So which brings me to my first to my first talk. I want to introduce our speakers. These are amazing investors that have been leading in investing in Africa. So I'm going to start 1 minute introductions. I'm going to start with Femi.
Thanks, Tongai. Hello, everyone. My name is Femi. Femi Awoniyi. I lead the Google Black Founders Fund in Africa initiative, which is Google's way of supporting Black-led businesses around the world through non-dilutive funding and the best of Google. So I lead the program in Africa, and I'm extremely passionate about connecting startups with investors and helping to drive customer-centric innovation. It's a pleasure to be here today.
Thank you, Femi. Thank you, Femi. I appreciate it. George?
Hi, I'm George Payne. So I'm one of the investors at Adibus. So we're a Web3 focused fund. Have backed AfriBlocks, super excited about what they're building there. We have built a fund basically with the thesis that decentralization and crypto blockchain are incredibly important for Africa and will be a crucial part of the technology infrastructure going forward. And so we're helping enable builders in that space with not just capital, but also looking at bringing in education and resources to help them scale.
Great. Thank you so much. Joseph?
Yeah, thanks, Tongai. I'm Joseph Lassen. I'm with CMT Digital. We are also a Web3 native investment fund. And much of our thesis is around the impact that the blockchain and distributed ledger technology will have in emerging markets, and a lot around kind of fund remittance and how money can move more effectively in emerging markets, and also offer services to customers that normally wouldn't be able to have them. So we're very bullish on the Africa thesis and are actively looking at investments in the space. So glad to be here today.
Thank you. I'll just dive in. The first question that I have to Femi, I know you talk to a lot of founders, you talk to a lot of startups. What has been the trend that you've been seeing in terms of, is it still, because it has been a lot of fintech, is it still fintech? Is it edtech, or now it's a bit, more distributed in terms of the founders that have been reaching out to you?
So it's interesting you say this, because I recently worked with Writer Bridges, the market intelligence company, on an investor roundtable for my advisory. And some of the interesting insights we saw was that fintech is still leading, as you'd expect. It's quite a bit of a mammoth of a sector, but we're seeing a little more diversification. So I would say, for instance, 2022, fintech remained the top sector, capturing about a third of the funding value. But we're seeing a lot more diversification moving into other sectors like clean tech and logistics and mobility, attracting more funding. Clean tech especially seems to be garnering a lot of investor focus of recent. So I would say you should keep that in mind and just watch the space. But yeah, so fintech is still the leader, but we're seeing a lot more of a spread of the pie as investors look to other sectors for, I would say, startup support and scale.
Great. Then this question towards to George. The regions, though, what have you seen? I know all investors have their thesis and what regions they target in, but what have you seen? Has there been a shift in terms of the big four, or now it's more distributed, like, more different African countries have been getting investment, George?
So I think that we continue to see a lot of activity in Nigeria and Lagos, and I think partly because of the density of the population within Lagos and the fact that there's a lot of builders in the same space, and there's a lot of people, and so distribution of technology and ideas happens at a rate faster than what is seen in other sub-Saharan regions. I think that investors a lot of the time generally have to be proactive about having boots on ground and networks in other regions in order to pick up deal flow and also support the entrepreneurs in different areas, because I think it's the first stage is getting into Lagos, Nigeria, and so that we you always have like a big and very strong cohort of entrepreneurs there. We are starting to see it in other regions as well, so kind of proactively getting involved in regions further south. There are entrepreneurs and great builders, fantastic people doing stuff in those regions. A lot of the time it's about visibility and just kind of like getting involved in those areas. And so I would say that there's kind of the investor and the startup market suffers, as most other markets do, from asymmetric information. So you just don't necessarily have that visibility. And so the onus generally is on investors to get more involved in other regions to see more pickup in those areas. And then also just highlighting what those startups are doing. But we are seeing an increasing number from across Africa.
That's great to hear. That's great to hear, because I think to our viewers, including me, I know raising is difficult. Raising is hard in any part of the world. So I guess one or more question that most founders ask is, this is a question to Joseph. What, I would say top three, there are a lot of things, but what top three things that founders should make sure they have, or should make sure they take care of when they are they start going out to raise?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think probably the first thing that's the most essential is have a very clear problem statement and a very clear solution statement. So which problem are you solving? How did you identify that problem? And then very clearly, how are you solving that problem? And it'll depend on, of course, the stage of the business. If it's an earlier stage company, pre-seed or a seed stage business, a lot of investors will be interested in, how does this idea scale? What's the competitive advantage? Why can you solve this problem better than somebody else? So answering those questions is very important. I think as you get into later stage, so maybe a seed, Series A or Series B, the most important thing is to show user growth and adoption of the solution. Are people using the platform that you're building or the company that you're building? So those would probably be the first two things. And then the third thing, I think, is really about team. And you have a strong, founder or co-founder who comes to me as a VC and has good past experience or very kind of strong network in where they're building. That usually speaks very highly in concert with the previous statements. So I would say those are kind of the top considerations for pitching VCs. Of course, there's a lot more, but those are probably the most important.
Great, great. Thank you. There's always been the talk about community as well. Like, as an entrepreneur, as a founder, to join other networks of founders, talk to other founders and, basically learn and share ideas. The question I have to Femi is around hubs. What role, if any, do they have to play in the success of founders, the success of startups, in them being able to raise and them being able to reach more customers based on your experience?
Thanks, Nogay. That's a really good question. So hubs have, I would say, a significant role to play just in the sense of ecosystem enabling and across a number of different pillars. So one is just from a business structuring standpoint. So a lot of founders tend to be dreamers and have this big vision that they have for their idea, which is usually when they encounter hubs. But there's an extra layer of really structuring the business to make sure that it's number one, piloted and tested. Their solution is piloted and tested in the market properly. A lot of the foundational things around corporate structures are put in place, and really they have an enabling environment to really grow that business. And this is where hubs come in, because hubs tend to support a lot of early stage companies, providing the right infrastructure, even if it's just down to space, which is very vital for an early stage company. And then you also have, when you layer the community aspect to it, where you're working through an idea or a business and you're literally surrounded by people that are trying to do the same thing, trying to cheer you on, and you're feeding off the different, I'll say even the energy, or feeding off the advice and mistakes that some of the founders around you have learned. And then lastly, and probably quite significantly, is the funding. So hubs usually are conduits for early stage funding. Examples would be, for instance, CC Hub, that's working on a 15 million EdTech challenge right now, looking to support about 72 EdTech companies over the next 3 years. They would, for instance, in this particular example, be a nice conduit through which people get a lot of their early stage funding, right, which they need to scale from one level to the next. So I would say hubs have an absolutely significant role to play, and we need more of them on the African continent.
Perfect. I think this brings me to my next question. If we're talking about tech hubs, there's also the question about accelerators. Are they helpful? At which stage should you join? And I want to ask this to George, because we are currently going through the Adverse program, which has been super helpful in terms of what we're building. So George, what are your thoughts and advice on a startup that's looking to get investment and also looking to accelerate in that regard?
I think there's a few considerations here, because we started the program, like the accelerator, because when we started writing checks into Africa, we realized that a lot of the material and a lot of the education that's geared towards entrepreneurs, like you've seen out of YC over very, very successfully over many, many years, it's based on the assumption that there's this, the end user is this homo economicus that can act rationally, knows how to spend money online, has access to the latest smartphone, and that's generally what you're optimizing for. And that context doesn't necessarily exist in Africa. And a lot of the literature that's come out of Silicon Valley is not necessarily tailored or works as planned in Africa. That's not to say that it's not applicable. It just needs some kind of considerations and adjustments. And so what we did is, we were saying, okay, well, we found these awesome entrepreneurs that are doing really great things. How can we bring education around, how can we develop a program around kind of enhancing that specifically for this context that we're building in? And that's why we've done it. So what we're trying to do is be a value add once we've invested. I think that what a lot of African entrepreneurs need to be cautious of, though, is early stage accelerators that you can give a lot of equity away for what is not necessarily that much help. And I think that there's kind of a really, really sort of fine line you do need to consider it. Just because you've been scouted for, found out about, and asked to join an accelerator doesn't mean you should do it. It can harm your raise later on. and that's a consideration. Obviously, it's a little bit different with Web3 because there's different kinds of raising, and there's going to be different pathways that you kind of move down. But it's kind of the case that accelerators can be a great ad, like we've seen it with YC, like that's responsible for just incredible amounts of value across the world. But you do want to be cautious of like what you enter into. And I think that, again, there's a fine line, like what we kind of like, a big part of what we want to do is increase the education for this context. So specifically for Africa, building out like actually how do you get from 0 to 1 in Africa? That looks different to Silicon Valley. That looks different to the US, to Europe, to the Eastern markets. And so I think that accelerators can be really helpful in terms of like developing that education and that wealth of resources for emerging market founders. But word of caution about entering into the next accelerator that you find or come across, because they're not necessarily going to be helpful down the road when it comes to raising, diluting your cap table and things like that. So that was just what I would say on that.
That's so interesting, because one of the things that founders should be careful about, when you're building and you reach a point where you really need that funding, but still you need to be very careful on, who you allow on your cap table, because you're thinking about today, but that's going to affect your future raise. That's going to affect, because when investors, I'm sure you know this, when you come in, you look at the cap table, and that, affects whether you're going to invest or not. So the question that I have to Joseph, to our audience is, what are some of the things that you should be careful about as a founder when you are going out to raise? It's so easy for you to just accept and accept things that will potentially harm you in the future.
Yeah, I really like this question because oftentimes I think on pitch calls, entrepreneurs feel like they're the ones being interviewed. I think it should be both ways. Entrepreneurs should be interviewing the investors as well. So I think there's a few things that you can, as an entrepreneur, look out for. And I like what George said kind of about the specificity of specific markets in Africa. If you have a VC or an investor, for example, that maybe isn't familiar with the market or doesn't understand your value proposition and is looking to invest in the round, I think a good question for somebody like that would be, as we scale, how can you support us in an ongoing way? Because capital is good, and of course you need capital on the cap table, but also having people that understand, a market or a growth plan or have connections for a next round rather than being passive, I think is very important. Yeah. I think also as an entrepreneur, it's a very fair question to ask a VC to speak with the entrepreneurs of some of their other portfolio companies in order to understand how those entrepreneurs have found the investor. I think there are a couple of other important considerations. With the construction of the cap table, it's usually better to have kind of more investors, let's call it, 10 investors rather than one investor that will take the entire round. More investors will typically give you more value add. You can figure out which ones do, support the business in the best way. And then you can utilize those connections better going forward. And I think as an entrepreneur, you need to decide what you want from your investors as well. So do you want passive capital that's just going to write a check and then not talk to you for the next year or until your next fundraise? Or do you really want somebody that's on the phone with you every week, making introductions? We got this deal sheet from a customer. What do you think? I think that gauging that is very important. So those are a couple of things that I would really think about when you're seeking investment and speaking with investors.
Thank you. I think our time is almost up, but I have two more questions that some of our committee members have asked me before, and I guess the first one to Femi is, what other methods can founders use besides venture capital to be able to grow their businesses, to scale, and to be able, to survive basically as a startup?
Thanks, Ngai. So I think this question or my answer would depend on the stage of the business.
Yeah.
Because I think you need different methods or mediums of funding depending on whether you're early stage or your growth stage. But I'll focus on early stage because those tend to be the ones that need support the most. I think depending on the nature of your business, apart from equity funding, there's a rise in a lot of non-dilutive funding / grant funding initiatives that have come to the African continent that I think a lot of founders should look to explore.
Yeah.
And the reason why I say this is because, firstly, you're getting funding that doesn't affect your cap table, like Joseph was kind enough to kind of elaborate on.
Yeah.
And you're also going to be able to get, and it's for lack of a better word, I'll use experimental funding that you can learn lessons from and make mistakes without it being, for instance, as expensive as equity or as expensive as debt. And we're seeing, depending on your sector, you see a lot of people coming into the African continent looking to actually provide this method of funding. I think people should be more proactive and braver in looking to apply for this medium of funding as much as possible. And I typically advise early stage companies to move away from debt. And the reason why is because as you're looking to solidify your business model, it's very risky tying yourself to the obligation of having to pay back funding, especially at typically high interest rates, considering the nature of startups as a whole. So
Yeah.
I would say non-dilutive funding is the one that I would say as much as possible, especially those that are brought through by a lot of corporate entities, like the Black Founders Fund as an example, or by governmental entities looking from, I would say, innovation-friendly governments that are looking to spur growth for startups in their local regions. So that's the one I would say, especially for early stage companies. The other funding types, as you'd imagine, right now is very tricky. Like you said, funding in Africa is being impacted, not as much as other regions, but you still see the impact where equity funding is dropping. Or at the very least, you need to explain to investors a lot more why they should give you money. So I would say that as much as possible during this time where things aren't as straightforward to raise, non-dilutive or grant funding is the way to go, just to kind of cushion the blow and increase your runway.
Got you. And yeah, just to add, I was reading the story of the Calendly founder. He raised 500,000 and then he bootstrapped for years. So bootstrapping is something that's hard, but it's doable as well. As a way to keep going. And I get my final question to George is around. This question I've been asked a lot, and I get it, but some founders don't. Why do investors not sign NDAs? Why do investors not sign NDAs? Because a lot of people are like, this is my idea, whatnot. But I always say, your idea, it's fine, but the execution is the biggest thing. George.
I think it's and I kind of want to give the opportunity to other people as well, maybe if they have a comment on this. I mean, I personally don't, as like an angel or otherwise, want to go down that track because it does create this like massive bottleneck around just looking at stuff. I think that to an extent, it's almost a hallmark of someone who's it's their first time thing and they don't really know, what the funding process looks like, because they're like, oh, an idea is worth $1 million. Like, no, there's no such thing as $1 million idea. Like execution, the team, everything. And frankly, when it gets to the stage where they're signing an NDA to look at an idea, you can guarantee that idea has not been circulated or socialized with friends, advisors, mentors, or just like people who can just sense check it, because you'll get it and you'll be like, it hasn't actually been fleshed out. It's not worth investing. So I think that generally speaking, people need to also consider the fact that like no VC is really if you've done like a legitimate check and like you haven't just like randomly found someone online, is going to steal the idea. You know, we're looking at hundreds of deals a month, possibly more. And we don't necessarily have, you know, the direct domain experience. You have to build a team around it. So I think that the worry that things get stolen is just kind of like, it's just not going to happen. And they're more likely to back you if they think it's a really good idea because you have come up with it and you put the idea together. So I think, yeah, I generally would advise people against kind of like requiring NDAs for it. And the other thing as well is it can come across as very strange as well. I came literally recently got a doc send from someone, and I didn't open it, but somebody else did first, and it immediately signed an NDA as like part of, you click on to open it, and then it signed it for you automatically. And it was the weirdest thing. It freaked him out, and he was like, "Okay, this is super strange. Why would you sign? Like, it's not even like technically legal to do that." If you're going down, yeah, I would really just sort of like take a minute to be like, okay, don't like, just think about why you're requiring someone to do an NDA. If it's like a very different kind of technology, it's a hardware, there's proprietary information, there's like a patent pending, and there's like I don't know, I don't operate in that space, so maybe there are realms in which it does make sense. But software, fast-moving startups, like, I would just generally avoid, advise against requiring NDAs.
Great.
I think I agree with all of George's points, and just very quickly, for a venture capitalist or an investor, it's a reputational risk to share ideas of founders as well that you don't have permission to share. So we are actually incentivized not to share ideas that we haven't been granted permission by the founder, just because then as an investor, you get that reputation and then you lose your deal flow. So our incentives are aligned to actually not to sign the NDA.
Great. Guys, appreciate you. Thank you so much, for taking time out of your busy schedules to talk to our community. Any comments, leave in the comment section. Any questions, we have the information of the speakers on screen. You can reach out to them. But thank you so much, and looking forward to the next panel. Freelancers Summit is still going on, and our theme this year is freelancing, entrepreneurship, and beyond. Thank you.